81 years ago, during the frozen hell of the Ardennes offensive, Lieutenant James Morrison vanished without a trace. His absence plunged his young wife, Margaret, and infant daughter, Sarah, into decades of anguish and unanswered questions, while his squadron mates could only wonder what became of their fearless wingman. Military records offered theories but no conclusions. The case fell into official obscurity, yet the Morrison family never stopped believing that someday, somehow, the truth would surface. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. December 18, 1944. The snow fell heavy across the Belgian countryside as the German Wehrmacht launched their final desperate gambit, what would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge. At Florennes Airfield, the 365th Fighter Group prepared for another grueling day of close air support missions. The morning briefing was tense. German forces had broken through Allied lines, and American troops were scattered and surrounded throughout the Ardennes forest. Lieutenant James Morrison sat quietly in the back row, methodically checking his flight notes. At 23, the farm boy from Dayton, Ohio, had already completed 47 combat missions over occupied Europe. His P47 Thunderbolt, nicknamed Margaret's Promise after his wife back home, bore the scars of countless encounters with German fighters and flak batteries. Morrison was known among his squadron as steady and reliable, the kind of pilot you wanted on your wing when things got dangerous. The mission seemed routine enough, a reconnaissance flight over the Orth River Valley to identify German positions and report back to headquarters. Morrison would fly alone, as was common for reconnaissance missions, using his aircraft's speed and agility to avoid enemy contact. Weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly, with thick fog rolling in from the west, but command insisted the intelligence was critical. As Morrison walked toward his aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness, Ground Crew Chief Sergeant Murphy called out, "Bring her home safe, Lieutenant. That fog's getting thicker by the minute." Morrison nodded and climbed into the cockpit, beginning his pre-flight checklist with characteristic precision. At 0630 hours, Margaret's Promise roared down the runway and disappeared into the grey morning sky. The last radio transmission came at 0715 hours. Morrison's voice crackled through the static. "Control, this is Thunder 7, visibility near zero, continuing south toward target area." Then silence. When he failed to return by 1100 hours, search aircraft were scrambled, but the fog had become impenetrable. For 3 days, Allied pilots searched the Ardennes, finding nothing but empty forest and abandoned German positions. Morrison's squadron commander, Major Williams, personally flew search missions until weather conditions became impossible. "Jimmy was the best pilot I had," Williams later wrote to Margaret Morrison. "If anyone could have made it through that fog, it would have been him. We'll keep looking." But as the Battle of the Bulge intensified and casualties mounted, the search for one missing pilot became a lower priority. Margaret Morrison received the telegram on Christmas Eve 1944. "The War Department regrets to inform you that your husband, First Lieutenant James Morrison, has been reported missing in action over Belgium since December 18, 1944. The words felt surreal, disconnected from reality. Just 6 months earlier, Jimmy had held their newborn daughter Sarah, promising he would come home after the war. Now Margaret faced the prospect of raising their child alone, with no answers and no closure. The official investigation concluded that Lieutenant Morrison's aircraft had likely crashed in German-occupied territory, either due to mechanical failure or enemy action. His status remained missing in action, a bureaucratic limbo that prevented Margaret from receiving full widow's benefits and left the family in financial hardship. For months, she wrote letters to the War Department, pleading for more information, for a more thorough search, for anything that might explain what happened to her husband. The responses were always the same: polite, bureaucratic, and ultimately useless. "Every effort is being made to locate missing personnel," one letter stated. "You will be notified immediately when additional information becomes available." But no additional information ever came. As 1945 turned into 1946 and the war ended without Jimmy's return, Margaret slowly accepted that her husband was gone forever. Yet something deep inside her refused to let go completely. She kept his flight jacket hanging in their bedroom closet, maintained his side of the bed, and told young Sarah stories about her father, the hero pilot. Margaret remarried in 1950 to a kind man named Robert Chen, but she never stopped wondering what really happened in that fog-shrouded forest on December 18, 1944. The years following the war brought rapid change to America, but for the Morrison family, time seemed frozen in December 1944. While the nation celebrated victory and embraced prosperity, Margaret Chen, formerly Morrison, lived with the constant ache of unfinished business. Her daughter Sarah grew up knowing her biological father only through photographs and stories, a ghost who cast a long shadow over their quiet household in suburban Dayton. Margaret's new husband, Robert, understood the burden she carried. He never asked her to remove Jimmy's photos from the mantel or pack away his medals and citations. The Purple Heart and Distinguished Flying Cross remained displayed in their modest living room, silent testaments to a man who never came home. But Robert also witnessed Margaret's monthly ritual of writing letters to the Veterans Administration, the Air Force Historical Research Agency, and anyone else who might have information about her first husband's fate. The responses, when they came at all, were form letters signed by clerks who had never heard of Lieutenant James Morrison. Records from the 365th Fighter Group are incomplete, one typical response read. Many documents were lost or destroyed during the immediate post-war period. We regret that no additional information is available at this time. Margaret would read these letters at the kitchen table, her jaw set in quiet determination, then file them in a growing folder labeled Jimmy Official Correspondence. Sarah Chen grew up acutely aware of the mystery that defined her family. In school, when other children talked about their fathers, she would mention both Robert, who raised her, and Jimmy, who died in the war. Her classmates often seemed confused by this arrangement, but Sarah learned early that some truths were too complicated for simple explanations. She inherited her mother's stubborn streak and began asking her own questions about the missing pilot who shared her DNA. In 1962, when Sarah turned 18, she wrote her first letter to the Air Force requesting information about her father's disappearance. The response was nearly identical to those her mother had received for almost 2 decades. We regret that additional information regarding Lieutenant Morrison's case is not available. His status remains missing in action. But this letter included a new detail that sparked Sarah's interest, a reference to classified operational records that might contain relevant information but were not available for public review. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, as America grappled with Vietnam and social upheaval, the Morrison family's private war continued. Margaret's health began to decline. Decades of stress and uncertainty had taken their toll, but she never stopped believing that answers existed somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of military records. She attended air shows and veterans reunions, hoping to meet someone who had served with Jimmy, someone who might remember something the official reports had missed. Occasionally, these efforts yielded fragments of information. A former ground crewman remembered Morrison as always worried about his wife and baby back home. A navigator from another squadron recalled seeing a P47 flying unusually low through the fog on December 18th, but couldn't be certain it was Morrison's aircraft. These tidbits of memory became precious to Margaret, proof that her husband had existed, that his disappearance mattered to someone besides his family. Robert Chen proved to be an unexpected ally in the search for truth. As a civil engineer, he understood bureaucracy and persistence. He helped Margaret organize her correspondence, create timeline charts, and develop strategies for navigating military archives. When the Freedom of Information Act passed in 1966, Robert was the first to suggest they use it to request Jimmy's complete service record. The documents that arrived months later were heavily redacted, with entire paragraphs blacked out for national security reasons. But between the censored lines, a picture emerged of Lieutenant Morrison's final weeks. He had been flying increasingly dangerous missions as German resistance stiffened. His aircraft had required major repairs after a close encounter with enemy fighters on December 10th. Most significantly, there were references to special reconnaissance assignments that weren't detailed in his standard mission reports. Sarah, now a college student studying journalism, began to suspect that her father's disappearance might involve more than a simple training accident or mechanical failure. The timing was suspicious. December 18, 1944 was the second day of the Battle of the Bulge, when German forces were advancing rapidly and Allied intelligence was desperate for information about enemy positions. Could Jimmy have been carrying sensitive intelligence when he disappeared? Could his mission have been more important than the family had been told? Margaret's health continued to deteriorate throughout the 1970s. The The combination of decades-old grief and frustration with military bureaucracy had worn her down. She developed heart problems and chronic fatigue, but still insisted on writing her monthly letters to various agencies. "I won't die wondering," she told Sarah. "That boy deserves to have his story told, even if it takes 50 years. In 1979, Margaret Morrison Chen passed away at age 62, having never learned what happened to her first husband. Her funeral was small, but dignified, attended by neighbors, Robert's family, and a handful of World War II veterans who had known Jimmy. Sarah delivered the eulogy, promising her mother that the search would continue. "Some stories take a lifetime to tell," she said, looking out at the modest gathering. "But every story deserves an ending." Sarah inherited her mother's folder of correspondence, now thick with decades of letters, official responses, and fragments of memory. She also inherited something else, an unshakable conviction that Lieutenant James Morrison's story was far from over. By 1980, Sarah Chen had built a successful career as an investigative journalist for the Columbus Dispatch, but the mystery of her father's disappearance remained her most elusive story. Armed with her mother's meticulous files and her own professional skills, she began what would become a decades-long investigation into the military bureaucracy that had failed her family for over 35 years. Sarah's approach was methodical and relentless. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests with every relevant agency: the Air Force, the Army, the CIA, even the State Department. She contacted veterans organizations, aviation museums, and amateur historians who specialized in World War II aircraft losses. Each lead generated more questions than answers, but slowly, a pattern began to emerge that suggested Lieutenant Morrison's final mission was far from routine. The breakthrough came in 1983, when Sarah located retired Major Thomas Williams, her father's former squadron commander, living in a veterans' home in Phoenix. Williams, now in his 70s and suffering from emphysema, had carried his own burden of guilt about Morrison's disappearance for nearly 4 decades. When Sarah called him, his voice cracked with emotion. "I've been wondering when someone from Jimmy's family would find me. There are things I should have told your mother years ago." Williams revealed that Morrison had volunteered for increasingly dangerous missions in the final weeks before his disappearance. "Jimmy was worried about you and your mother," Williams explained during their phone conversation. "He knew the war would end soon, and he wanted to build up as much combat pay as possible before going home. I should have said no to some of those missions, but Jimmy was my best pilot. I trusted him to come back." More significantly, Williams confirmed Sarah's suspicions about the December 18th mission. "That wasn't just reconnaissance," he admitted. "Intelligence had reports of a new German secret weapon being moved through the Ardennes. Jimmy was supposed to photograph whatever he could find and report back immediately. The mission was classified at the highest levels. That's probably why you've never gotten straight answers from the Air Force." This revelation transformed Sarah's understanding of her father's disappearance. If Morrison had been carrying classified intelligence when he went down, his case would have been handled by military intelligence agencies rather than normal casualty processing. Records might have been sealed indefinitely, especially if they involved sensitive information about German weapons programs or Allied intelligence operations. Sarah spent months trying to contact other members of her father's squadron, but many had died in the intervening decades, and those who remained were often reluctant to discuss classified missions from 40 years earlier. The wall of official silence that had frustrated her mother now seemed even more impenetrable, reinforced by national security classifications that might never be lifted. In 1985, Sarah married David Morrison. She kept her father's name professionally and started a family of her own. Her son James, named after the grandfather he would never meet, grew up surrounded by the same mystery that had shaped Sarah's childhood. But unlike previous generations, young James had access to new tools for historical research: personal computers, electronic databases, and eventually the internet. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested to know what places and what moments of day or night these documented accounts reach. As Sarah entered middle age, her search for answers became more sophisticated. She connected with other families of missing World War II servicemen, forming informal networks of amateur investigators who shared information and resources. She learned about advances in battlefield archaeology and forensic science that were helping to identify remains found in former war zones. Most importantly, She discovered that her father's case was not unique. Hundreds of American airmen remained missing from the European theater, their fates unknown despite decades of official indifference. The end of the Cold War in 1991 brought new hope for accessing classified records, but also new frustrations. While some World War II documents were declassified, many others remained sealed for ongoing national security reasons that seemed increasingly arbitrary after nearly 50 years. Sarah attended declassification hearings and lobbied congressional representatives, but progress was measured in inches rather than miles. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of her father's disappearance, Sarah published a lengthy investigative series in the Columbus Dispatch titled The Missing: How Military Bureaucracy Failed America's War Heroes. The series focused on her father's case, but examined the broader pattern of official indifference toward missing servicemen and their families. The articles generated significant public interest and prompted several other families to contact Sarah with similar stories of bureaucratic stonewalling and lost records. The series also attracted attention from unexpected sources. Sarah received a letter from a retired CIA analyst who had worked on post-war intelligence assessments of German weapons programs. The analyst, who requested anonymity, suggested that Morrison's final mission might have been related to Operation Paperclip, the secret American program to recruit German scientists after the war. If Morrison had discovered information about German rocket technology or other sensitive programs, his case files might have been transferred to intelligence agencies and classified indefinitely. This possibility opened new avenues for Sarah's investigation, but also highlighted the enormous challenges she faced. Intelligence records were even more difficult to access than military personnel files, and the agencies involved had little incentive to cooperate with civilian researchers. Sarah found herself navigating a maze of bureaucracy, classification systems, and institutional secrecy that seemed designed to prevent exactly the kind of investigation she was conducting. By the late 1990s, Sarah had accumulated boxes of documents, photographs, and correspondence related to her father's case, but she was no closer to definitive answers than her mother had been 50 years earlier. The trail seemed to end in the fog-shrouded forests of Belgium, where Lieutenant James Morrison had vanished on a cold December morning in 1944. The new millennium brought technological advances that revolutionized historical research, but for Sarah Morrison, the digital age initially offered more frustration than revelation. Government databases remained largely inaccessible to civilians, and while the internet connected her with fellow researchers around the world, it also amplified the echo chamber of speculation and dead ends that had characterized her father's case for decades. Sarah's son James, now a software engineer in his 20s, became increasingly involved in the search for his grandfather's fate. Unlike previous generations who had relied on letters and phone calls, James approached the mystery with digital tools and systematic data analysis. He created spreadsheets tracking every lead, every document, every fragment of information the family had gathered over 5 decades. More importantly, he began reaching out to European researchers and aviation archaeologists who specialized in locating crash sites from World War II. The breakthrough came in 2003 when James connected with Dr. Klaus Weber, a German aviation historian who had spent years documenting Allied aircraft losses in the Ardennes region. Weber's database included hundreds of crash sites, many still unexplored due to dense forest cover and the presence of unexploded ordnance. When James shared the details of Lieutenant Morrison's disappearance, Weber's response was immediate and intriguing. "I have been waiting 30 years for someone to ask about this case." Weber explained that local Belgian historians had documented several unexplained aircraft debris finds in the Ourthe River Valley, including engine parts that appeared to be from American fighters. However, these discoveries had never been properly investigated by military authorities, and the debris remained scattered in private collections or local museums. Most significantly, Weber had identified a specific area where multiple eyewitness accounts from 1944 described seeing a low-flying P47 Thunderbolt disappearing into fog on December 18th. Sarah felt a familiar surge of hope mixed with skepticism. After decades of false leads and bureaucratic dead ends, she had learned to temper her expectations, but Weber's research seemed more thorough and professional than anything she had encountered before. His maps and documentation suggested that Lieutenant Morrison's aircraft had indeed crashed in Belgian territory, probably in a remote section of the Ardennes forest that remained largely undisturbed since the war. Working with Weber, Sarah and James began planning their first trip to Belgium. The logistics were complicated. They needed permissions from multiple government agencies, cooperation from local landowners, and expertise in battlefield archaeology. Weber connected them with Marc Marique, a Belgian researcher who specialized in crash site investigations and had worked with several families of missing American airmen. The expedition in 2004 was both emotionally overwhelming and scientifically disappointing. Sarah stood in the forest where her father might have died, touching trees that could have witnessed his final moments. The landscape was beautiful but haunting. Rolling hills covered with dense woods, crossed by streams, and marked by scattered concrete bunkers from German defensive positions. It was easy to imagine how a pilot flying low in thick fog might become disoriented and crash in this terrain. However, the physical search yielded little concrete evidence. Metal detectors found scattered debris that could have come from any of dozens of aircraft that had operated in the area during the war. Ground-penetrating radar identified several subsurface anomalies, but excavation revealed only old farming equipment and natural rock formations. After a week of searching, the team had documented several interesting finds, but nothing that could definitively be linked to Lieutenant Morrison's P47. The trip did provide Sarah with something equally valuable: connections with other families searching for missing relatives and researchers who understood the complexities of her quest. She learned about advances in DNA analysis that could identify remains even after 60 years, about satellite imagery that could reveal crash sites invisible from ground level, and about legal frameworks that might compel governments to release classified records. Back in the United States, Sarah's investigation entered a new phase. She filed lawsuits under the Freedom of Information Act, demanding the release of all records related to her father's final mission. The legal battles stretched on for years, with government lawyers arguing that 60-year-old records somehow still posed threats to national security. Sarah's attorney fees mounted, but she pressed forward with the same determination that had driven her mother's decades-long letter-writing campaign. In 2008, after years of litigation, the Air Force finally released a partial file on Lieutenant Morrison's disappearance. The documents were heavily redacted, but they confirmed what Sarah had long suspected. Her father's final mission was indeed classified, involving reconnaissance of German positions that were believed to include experimental weapons facilities. The mission had been coordinated with Allied intelligence services and was considered critical to understanding German capabilities during the Battle of the Bulge. More intriguingly, the files included references to recovered materials and intelligence assessments that suggested something had been found after Morrison's disappearance. But these references were heavily censored, and follow-up documents were either missing or classified at even higher levels. Sarah found herself confronting the same wall of official secrecy that had frustrated her family for 6 decades. The released documents did provide one crucial piece of information: the exact coordinates of Lieutenant Morrison's intended target area. When Sarah shared these coordinates with Dr. Weber and Marc Marique, they realized that the location had never been properly searched. Previous investigations had focused on areas several miles away, based on incomplete witness accounts and official estimates of where the aircraft might have crashed. This discovery rekindled Sarah's hope and determination. At age 64, she began planning another expedition to Belgium, this time armed with precise coordinates and advanced search technology. She knew that her time was running out. She was approaching the same age at which her mother had died, still searching for answers. But she also knew that giving up would dishonor the memory of both her parents and abandon the truth that had driven her family's quest for 3 generations. James, now married with children of his own, fully supported his mother's continued investigation. "Grandpa Jimmy deserves to come home," he told his young son during a family dinner in 2009. "Sometimes it takes a long time to find someone, but that doesn't mean we stop looking." The 4-year-old boy nodded solemnly, not fully understanding the weight of the family legacy he was inheriting. By 2010, Sarah Morrison had transformed from a grieving daughter into something approaching a professional investigator. Her home office overflowed with maps, photographs, military records, and correspondence from researchers across Europe. The walls displayed her father's military decorations alongside detailed topographic maps of the Ardennes forest, creating a shrine to both memory and methodology that would have amazed her mother. The precision coordinates released in the classified documents had opened new possibilities, but they also revealed the enormous challenges of searching dense forest terrain that had remained largely untouched since 1944. The area specified in Lieutenant Morrison's mission orders was a remote valley system along the Author River, characterized by steep hillsides, thick undergrowth, and multiple stream channels that had shifted course over the intervening decades. Dr. Weber and Mark Marique developed a comprehensive search strategy that combined historical research with modern technology. They obtained permission from Belgian authorities to conduct a systematic survey of the target area using ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, and aerial photography to identify potential crash sites. The project would require significant funding and multiple expeditions over several years. Sarah liquidated her retirement savings to finance the search, viewing it as the most important investment of her life. Her son James contributed both money and expertise, using his software skills to create database systems for tracking finds and analyzing patterns in the scattered debris that littered the forest floor. The extended Morrison family, including cousins and distant relatives who had heard about Sarah's quest, provided additional financial support. The 2011 expedition was the most ambitious yet attempted. The team included professional archaeologists, military historians, and technical specialists with experience in battlefield recovery operations. They established a base camp in a nearby village and conducted systematic grid searches across several square kilometers of forest terrain. The work was painstaking and often discouraging. Decades of vegetation growth had obscured most surface features, and the presence of unexploded ordnance made excavation dangerous in many areas. Metal detectors registered hundreds of signals, but most proved to be fragments from artillery shells, personal equipment dropped by soldiers, or debris from other aircraft that had operated in the region during the war. However, the team did make several significant discoveries that suggested they were searching in the right area. They found pieces of aluminum sheeting that appeared to come from American aircraft, several .50 caliber machine gun rounds that matched the ammunition used by P47 Thunderbolts, and fragments of plexiglass that could have been from a fighter cockpit canopy. None of these finds could be definitively linked to Lieutenant Morrison's aircraft, but they confirmed that American planes had crashed in the immediate vicinity. The most intriguing discovery came on the final day of the expedition. Team member Philippe Gillin, a Belgian metal detecting specialist, located a small piece of engraved metal buried beneath the roots of an old oak tree. When cleaned, the fragment revealed part of a serial number that matched the numbering system used on P47 Thunderbolt engines during 1944. The fragment was photographed, documented, and sent to aviation specialists in the United States for analysis. Sarah returned from Belgium emotionally drained, but cautiously optimistic. The serial number fragment offered the first potential physical evidence directly linking a crash site to her father's aircraft. However, verification would take months, and even positive identification of the engine part wouldn't necessarily provide answers about Lieutenant Morrison's fate or the circumstances of his disappearance. While waiting for technical analysis results, Sarah continued her documentary research, now focusing on German records that might shed light on what her father had encountered during his final mission. Through Dr. Weber's connections, she gained access to Wehrmacht archives that described German positions in the Author River Valley during December 1944. These documents revealed a complex network of observation posts, anti-aircraft positions, and supply depots that had been established to support the Ardennes offensive. Most significantly, Sarah discovered references to a secret German facility, codenamed Schwarzwald, that had operated in the exact area where her father's aircraft was believed to have crashed. The facility's purpose was described only in general terms, but it appeared to involve testing of experimental anti-aircraft weapons or possibly early surface-to-air missiles. If Lieutenant Morrison had been tasked with photographing this installation, his mission would have been extremely dangerous and highly classified. The serial number analysis results arrived in early 2012, confirming that the metal fragment had indeed come from a P47 Thunderbolt engine manufactured in 1944. However, Records of individual engine assignments were incomplete, and specialists could not definitively prove that the engine had belonged to Lieutenant Morrison's aircraft. The fragment was consistent with his plane, but it could also have come from any of several dozen P47s that had operated in the region during the war. Despite this ambiguity, Sarah felt closer to answers than ever before. She had identified the probable crash site, established that American aircraft debris was present in the area, and uncovered evidence of German installations that would have been legitimate targets for reconnaissance missions. The pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to fit together, even if the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. James, meanwhile, had been conducting his own investigation using digital tools and social media to connect with descendants of other 365th Fighter Group personnel. Through online forums and genealogy websites, he located families of several pilots who had served with Lieutenant Morrison during his final weeks of combat. These connections provided new sources of oral history and family documentation that had never been available to official investigators. One of these contacts proved particularly valuable: the grandson of Sergeant Murphy, the ground crew chief who had spoken with Lieutenant Morrison before his final takeoff. The family had preserved Murphy's wartime diary, which included detailed entries about aircraft maintenance and pilot conversations during December 1944. The diary confirmed that Morrison's P47 had been equipped with special camera equipment for his December 18th mission, and that the pilot had seemed unusually tense before takeoff. Sarah realized that her investigation had reached a critical juncture. She possessed more information about her father's disappearance than any previous researcher, but significant questions remained unanswered. The crash site appeared to be located, but no human remains had been found. The mission's classified nature was confirmed, but its specific objectives remained obscure. Most importantly, the circumstances of Lieutenant Morrison's death, whether from mechanical failure, enemy action, or other causes, remained unknown. The winter of 2012 brought unexpected developments in Sarah Morrison's decades-long investigation. Dr. Weber contacted her with news that Belgian authorities were planning a major archaeological survey of World War II sites throughout the Ardennes region, prompted by upcoming commemorations of the war's 70th anniversary. The project would include professional excavation of several suspected crash sites, including the area where the team had found the engine fragment. Sarah saw this as a crucial opportunity, but also a potential threat to her family's quest for answers. Official archaeological work would be more thorough and scientifically rigorous than her privately funded expeditions, but it would also remove control from her hands and subject the investigation to bureaucratic timelines and political considerations. After consultation with James and her legal advisors, she decided to cooperate fully with the Belgian project while maintaining her own parallel research efforts. The archaeological team, led by Dr. Marie Dubois from the University of Liège, brought sophisticated equipment and systematic methodology to the search. Ground-penetrating radar surveys revealed several significant subsurface anomalies, including what appeared to be a large metal object buried approximately 3 meters below the current ground level. The location corresponded closely to coordinates from Lieutenant Morrison's final mission and the area where the engine fragment had been discovered. Excavation began in April 2013, with Sarah and James present as observers. The work proceeded slowly and carefully, with each layer of soil systematically documented and all metal fragments photographed and catalogued. After weeks of painstaking excavation, the team uncovered substantial wreckage from what was clearly an American fighter aircraft, including sections of the fuselage, wing panels, and mechanical components. The most significant discovery came on May 15th, when excavators exposed a portion of the aircraft's engine block. The serial numbers were clearly visible and matched the production records for Lieutenant Morrison's P47 Thunderbolt. After 69 years, the family had finally located the aircraft that had carried their father and grandfather into the fog on that December morning in 1944. However, the excavation also raised new questions about the circumstances of the crash. The wreckage pattern suggested that the aircraft had impacted the ground at a steep angle and high speed, indicating either mechanical failure or loss of control rather than a forced landing attempt. More puzzling was the absence of any human remains or personal effects that might be associated with Lieutenant Morrison. Dr. Dubois explained that soil conditions in the Ardennes could have completely dissolved organic materials over 7 decades, but the absence of metal personal items like dog tags, belt buckles, or jewelry was unusual. The aircraft's cockpit area had been severely damaged in the crash, but there should have been some trace of the pilot's presence. The team expanded their excavation around the crash site, searching for remains that might have been thrown clear during the impact. If this case has already captured your attention, please leave a like. It helps Lieutenant Morrison's story reach more people. The search for human remains continued through the summer of 2013, with forensic specialists joining the archaeological team. They employed advanced techniques including DNA analysis of soil samples and microscopic examination of bone fragments, but found no definitive evidence of Lieutenant Morrison's fate. The crash site had yielded his aircraft, but not the pilot himself. Sarah found these results both satisfying and deeply frustrating. After decades of searching, she had finally located her father's P47 and confirmed that he had crashed in the exact area specified in his classified mission orders. The archaeological evidence proved that Lieutenant Morrison had reached his target area and that his aircraft had suffered a catastrophic failure or been shot down while operating at low altitude. But the mystery of what happened to the pilot himself remained unsolved. The Belgian investigation did uncover additional evidence about the German installations that had been Lieutenant Morrison's target. Excavation of nearby defensive positions revealed sophisticated anti-aircraft equipment, including early radar systems and experimental guided missiles. Documents found in a buried command bunker confirmed that German forces had been testing advanced weapon systems in the area during December 1944, precisely when Lieutenant Morrison had been tasked with reconnaissance missions. These discoveries vindicated Sarah's long-held belief that her father's final mission had been more significant than routine reconnaissance. Lieutenant Morrison had been flying one of the war's most dangerous assignments, gathering intelligence about German secret weapons that could have affected the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge. His sacrifice had contributed to Allied victory, even though his specific achievements had remained classified for 7 decades. The German documents also provided clues about what might have happened to Lieutenant Morrison after his aircraft crashed. Several references described the capture of an American pilot in the Urther River Valley on December 18, 1944, though the pilot's identity was not specified. The documents indicated that captured airmen were usually transferred to prisoner-of-war camps, but records from the final months of the war were often incomplete or destroyed during the German retreat. This possibility opened new avenues for Sarah's investigation. If her father had survived the crash and been captured, he might have died in captivity or during the chaotic final weeks of the war. Alternatively, he might have escaped or been liberated, but died before his identity could be established. The absence of remains at the crash site suddenly seemed less mysterious and more hopeful. Lieutenant Morrison might have lived beyond December 18, 1944. Working with Belgian researchers and German archives, Sarah began tracing the fate of American airmen captured in the Ardennes during the winter of 1944-45. The records were fragmentary and often contradictory, but they revealed a complex network of temporary detention facilities, prisoner transfers, and improvised camps that had operated during the German retreat. Many American airmen had disappeared into this system and never been accounted for after the war. The investigation was entering uncharted territory, 70 years after the events in question. Sarah realized that she might never find definitive answers about her father's ultimate fate, but she had already accomplished more than seemed possible when she inherited her mother's folder of correspondence in 1979. Lieutenant Morrison's aircraft had been located, his mission's importance had been established, and his contribution to Allied victory had been documented. More importantly, Sarah had honored her family's decades-long commitment to seeking truth and ensuring that Lieutenant Morrison's sacrifice would not be forgotten. By 2015, Sarah Morrison was 71 years old and beginning to feel the physical toll of her lifelong quest. Arthritis made extended travel difficult, and her energy levels couldn't match the demanding pace of international research expeditions. However, her determination remained undiminished, and the discovery of her father's aircraft had reinvigorated her commitment to finding complete answers about Lieutenant Morrison's fate. James had gradually assumed primary responsibility for the day-to-day aspects of the investigation, applying his technical skills and younger energy to the complex task of tracing prisoner-of-war records across multiple countries and languages. He had developed relationships with researchers throughout Europe and established a systematic approach to documenting every lead and hypothesis about his grandfather's disappearance. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a German retiree named Hans Müller, who contacted the family through Dr. Weber's network of historical researchers. Müller's father had been a Wehrmacht sergeant stationed in the Ardennes during December 1944, and family documents included a diary that described capturing an American pilot near the Orte River. The diary entry was dated December 19, 1944, one day after Lieutenant Morrison's disappearance. Müller's father had written, "Found American flyer badly injured near crashed plane. Officer ordered immediate transport to field hospital, then prisoner collection point. Pilot spoke some German, said his name was James. Aircraft burned completely. Nothing left to salvage." The diary entry was brief but electrifying for Sarah and James, providing the first eyewitness account of Lieutenant Morrison's fate after his aircraft crashed. Working with German archival specialists, the family began tracing the network of field hospitals and prisoner collection points that had operated in the Ardennes during the winter of 1944–45. The records were scattered across multiple institutions and often incomplete, but they gradually revealed a complex system for processing captured Allied personnel during the chaotic final months of the war. The trail led to a temporary facility near Prüm, Germany, where severely wounded prisoners were supposedly treated before being transferred to permanent camps. However, records from this facility were particularly incomplete, and many documents had been destroyed during the German retreat in early 1945. The family found references to American airmen being treated there during December 1944, but specific identities were rarely recorded. Sarah made what would prove to be her final trip to Europe in the summer of 2016, accompanied by James and Dr. Weber. They visited the site of the former field hospital, now a peaceful agricultural area, with no visible traces of its wartime function. Local residents provided oral histories about the facility, including memories of American prisoners being brought there during the winter of 1944–45. Most significantly, they met with Anna Richter, an elderly German woman who had worked as a nurse's aide at the field hospital when she was just 16 years old. Richter had vivid memories of treating wounded American airmen, including one pilot who had been brought in with severe injuries after his plane crashed in the Ardennes. He was very young, she recalled, and he kept asking about his wife and baby daughter back in America. Richter's description matched what the family knew about Lieutenant Morrison, but she could not recall the pilot's specific name or what had ultimately happened to him. She explained that many severely wounded prisoners had died at the facility and been buried in temporary graves that were later relocated or lost during the post-war period. The constant movement of personnel and destruction of records had made it impossible to track individual cases. The investigation had reached another frustrating dead end, but Sarah felt a sense of completion that had eluded her for decades. She now knew that her father had survived his aircraft crash, had been captured and treated by German medical personnel, and had lived long enough to speak about his family back home. Whether he had ultimately survived the war remained unknown, but Sarah had finally learned that Lieutenant Morrison's story hadn't ended in the fog over Belgium on December 18, 1944. Returning to the United States, Sarah began working on a comprehensive documentation of her family's 7-decade search for answers. She wanted to ensure that future generations would understand not only what had happened to Lieutenant Morrison, but also what his disappearance had meant to the family that never stopped looking for him. The project became a collaboration between Sarah, James, and his teenage son David, who brought fresh perspective and digital skills to organizing the vast collection of documents, photographs, and testimonies. Sarah's health continued to decline throughout 2017 and 2018, but she remained focused on completing the historical record of her father's case. She testified before congressional hearings about the treatment of families of missing servicemen, advocated for declassification of World War II records, and worked with other families facing similar challenges. Her experience had transformed her from a victim of bureaucratic indifference into an expert advocate for governmental transparency and accountability. In early 2019, Sarah suffered a heart attack that left her partially disabled, but still mentally sharp. From her assisted living facility, she continued working on the documentary project and corresponding with researchers around the world. She had accepted that she would probably never learn Lieutenant Morrison's complete story, but she was determined to ensure that his sacrifice and her family's dedication would be preserved for history. The final major development in Sarah's lifetime came in December 2019, exactly 75 years after her father's disappearance. James received a call from the American Battle Monuments Commission, informing him that construction work at a cemetery in Germany had uncovered several unmarked graves containing the remains of American servicemen from World War II. DNA analysis was being conducted to identify the remains, and the Morrison family was asked to provide genetic samples for comparison. Sarah was too ill to travel to Germany for the exhumation, but she closely followed the scientific analysis process. The possibility that her father's remains might finally be identified and returned home for proper burial represented the culmination of her lifelong quest. Even if the DNA analysis proved negative, she took comfort in knowing that other families might finally receive answers about their missing loved ones. On March 15, 2020, Sarah Morrison passed away at age 76, having dedicated most of her adult life to searching for her father. She died without knowing the results of the DNA analysis, but surrounded by family members who promised to continue the search if necessary. Her funeral was attended by researchers from around the world who had been touched by her determination and inspired by her refusal to accept official indifference. James delivered the eulogy, promising his mother that Lieutenant Morrison's story would continue to be told and that the family's commitment to truth would be passed to the next generation. "Some mysteries take more than one lifetime to solve," he said, "but that doesn't mean we ever stop trying." The COVID-19 pandemic delayed many research projects worldwide, but for the Morrison family, 2020 brought both personal loss and unexpected revelation. While grieving Sarah's death and managing the disruption of global lockdowns, James continued monitoring the DNA analysis of remains discovered in Germany, hoping to provide his mother's spirit with the closure she had sought for 8 decades. The results came in July 2020. None of the remains belonged to Lieutenant Morrison. While disappointing, this news actually supported the theory that he had died elsewhere, possibly in the field hospital system that had left so few records. James found himself in the strange position of being relieved that his grandfather's body hadn't been found in an unmarked grave, while still lacking definitive answers about his ultimate fate. Young David Morrison, now 21 and studying archaeology at Ohio State University, had grown up surrounded by his family's quest and inherited both the passion and methodology that had driven 3 generations of searchers. Unlike his predecessors, David approached the mystery with modern scientific tools and a generation's worth of accumulated research to build upon. David's breakthrough came through an unlikely source: climate change research. Global warming had caused unusual weather patterns across Europe, including severe droughts that lowered water levels in rivers and streams throughout the Ardennes region. Belgian environmental scientists monitoring these changes had begun documenting historical artifacts exposed by receding waterlines, including military equipment from both world wars. In December 2020, exactly 76 years after Lieutenant Morrison's disappearance, a Belgian graduate student conducting river ecology research discovered a large metal object partially buried in the streambed of the Arthur River, approximately 2 kilometers downstream from the known crash site. Initial examination suggested it was part of an aircraft engine, but the object was too heavy and deeply embedded to remove without specialized equipment. Dr. Dubois, who had led the 2013 excavation, was contacted about the discovery. She immediately recognized the potential significance and arranged for proper archaeological recovery of the object. The COVID-19 restrictions complicated international collaboration, but James was able to participate virtually in the excavation planning and observe the recovery process through video links.